As Christians, we are called to model our lives, our daily living on Jesus Christ, as described in the Gospels. Maybe I should say we should model our lives on following Jesus' behavior, because we so often fall short of that. In this section in Luke, we see, as I've just read and described, how Jesus responded to temptation. But there's more to this passage than meets the eye. And I alluded to something else about the use of the word devil in the way it's not capitalized and that sort of thing. That's another very important point, but that's not what I want to focus on this morning. There's much more here than meets the eye. It's about Jesus' temptation, and his temptation is personal for him. His temptation, the three things that are listed there, aren't necessarily temptations that we directly wrestle with. These are his temptations. And when we look at these verses, we have to take into consideration that when, for instance, he was tempted to turn the stone into bread, it was a real temptation for him in ways that it wasn't for us, for two reasons right off the top of my head that I can think of. One is he could do it. He could turn the stone into bread. Can you? No, I can't either. The other is he was very, very hungry. He was in a fast. That is one of the reasons that people engage in fasting, in order to sharpen their spiritual wit, in order to make themselves more dependent, clear-minded, focused on their dependence on God. I've been hungry before. I mean hungry in the sense of it's about mealtime and I feel like I'm ready to eat. I've never been starving. I've never been malnourished. I've never been famished or any other adjectives you can think of. I've never been truly hungry, but I've wanted to eat before. But no matter how badly I want to eat, no matter how tempted I am to, I know there are no stones around here, but we could take, for example, a hymnal. No matter how tempted I am to turn this hymnal into, well, instead of, since it's not a stone, instead of bread, let's say a juicy steak, or better yet, soft shell crab sandwich. No matter how tempted I am to that, it doesn't enter my mind because I know that I can't. I lack that gift. I lacked those powers. On the other hand, the evil that lurks within all of us lurks within me too. And so there are plenty of areas in my life, just as there are in your lives, in which I am tempted. Now, some of you, especially those of you who pay very close attention, I'm not looking at anybody in particular, but may recall at various points I've sort of poked fun at smartphones. Sporadically, I make fun of things like that, technology. I don't know if anybody noticed, but 7, 8 months ago, I sort of stopped mentioning that. That was because I got one. This is my smartphone, and it's very clever. It's even got a little blinking thing right now that's telling me there's something. Maybe I have an email or something. Electronic gadgets are definitely a temptation for me. I like all of the features, all of the different things they can do. I'm fascinated on all the things they can cram into this tiny little device. That just blows my mind. For an analytical mind like mine, especially as I get into comparing tech specs and reading reviews, this temptation is tailor-made for me. And it was almost like flirting with the devil when I sort of made fun of it, because in my heart of hearts, I knew that I was going to get one, even as I mocked it somewhat open. I used my money to buy this little phone from eBay. It was money that I could have used to buy 10 mosquito nets from Church World Service. Or I could have bought 2 goats from Oxfam or World Vision to supply the needs of somebody in a less developed part of the world. Instead, I have this little gizmo, and it's really cool. But it's great and it's terrible all at the same time. It's great because I can now check, yes, I have an email, I have a message. I can check my email anywhere. It's terrible because I can check my email anywhere. No longer when I leave the office am I away from it. Now, of course, as temptations go, this has gotten way too personal. And so we're going to leave my temptation alone. But that's the nature of temptation. That's the whole point of it. It's personal. It's about you. It's about what's inside you and the way that you can be drawn away from God by something, anything. Each temptation is custom made for us, or just as it is in Luke 4, for Jesus. Throwing himself off the temple and having angels from heaven swoop in and save him would have solved a lot of problems for him. Can you imagine how the rest of the gospel would have unfolded? He wouldn't have had this sort of identity crisis. Who do they say that I am? It would have been like, well, Jesus, we remember the temple thing where you were up there, everybody saw you, we thought it was sort of a suicidal moment, and then you jump, and the angels from heaven came, and sort of it worked out. That's the problem with temptation. Giving into it is a step down a dangerous path. Suddenly, the path that God has called us to follow, one that leads closer to God, ever closer, ever further into a relationship with God, is no longer our path. We deviate from it whenever we give into a temptation. Oscar Wilde, the writer, once said, the best way, the only right way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. May West said something similar, like, I try so hard to avoid temptation until it gets really difficult. Give in. And these writers, that may be witty or funny, but it doesn't work that way. That's not the best way to deal with temptation. Although I don't want to, I'm going to go back to my phone as an example. It shows how this works. Because, see, I got the phone, and it was wonderful for a few months or month. I got this thing I truly didn't need. I gave in. And then I realized there was a better phone out there. There's one that actually, see, this has the Maps program, but it's not that great. Now, it has gotten us places before, but then it'll stop and be recalibrating. And I thought, no, I need this other one. And so every so often, even though I know this is just a ridiculous temptation, I find myself back on eBay, looking at phones and going, this one would do, maybe I'll put a bid in and see how that goes. But I know how that goes, because as soon as I place my bid, I'm hooked. In the Bible, in Luke 4, the word we have is this Greek word pierzo, that means to make a proof, or to attempt, to prove, to test, or to tempt. But our word for temptation comes to us from Latin through Old French and from about the 13th century. But see, that wouldn't lead us to think that temptation is something that's sort of new and maybe it's only been around. It's maybe a contemporary thing. Obviously, Jesus wasn't tempted by smartphones. But temptation has always been with us ever since humanity has been around. In James chapter 1, verse 14, it says, one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. That's why it's so perfect for us. Each temptation is perfect for us. The temptation is within us. It's our own desire, the things that we want. Now, Lent is a season in which we prepare for Easter. We began last Wednesday, on Ash Wednesday, to prepare our hearts to look ahead to the glorious resurrection of Easter Sunday morning. And we need to prepare because the Christian life is one that we don't live on cruise control. Now, just like driving, to use cruise control as an example, you can't stop paying attention. You can't now, once you put cruise control on, you don't have to keep your foot on the accelerator, but you can't now take your hands off the wheels, or off the wheel, and just let the car drive itself. Have you ever been distracted while driving? Anybody ever been distracted? Speaking of distractions while driving, I've never told a story about my mother-in-law before while preaching. I'm not going to now. I'm not going to break that streak. I will tell a story about myself, about being distracted while driving. When driving with the family, I've been driving long before, and looked down to change the track on the CD or something like that. And all of a sudden I'll hear while I'm looking down, whoa, 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 whoa. And I look up, and we've just come over a little further to the edge of the road and come back to the middle. And, you know, when it is rightly, accurately pointed out that the right line of the white line on the right-hand side was below the passenger who was telling me this, I said, well, I just wanted to make sure the pavement was okay over there. But it's easy to get distracted in our Christian lives. It's easy to lose our focus. Something comes up and it needs our time, it needs our attention. And suddenly we can't squeeze our time with God in. Maybe it's a daily devotion and we say, you know what, I'll get back on track. I'll get back to it tomorrow. Maybe it's our evening prayers. And we say, you know what, I'm just exhausted tonight. God, I'll talk to you about this tomorrow. And then the next day. And then the next day. Things get busier, more hectic, and it gets harder and harder. Suddenly, sometimes we get to Sunday mornings, and it's like, it just seems like a perfect place to put some extra me time in. I'll sleep in, have my coffee, wherever my coffee went, have my coffee, read the paper, because Sundays are such a perfect quiet time for that. Suddenly, we're down a path going further away from Christ. The temptation to live our faith gets unfocused, and we begin to think of it in terms of cruise control. During Lent, as we prepare for Easter, this is an annual season in which we can reinvigorate our focus on God. And by tackling this idea of temptation this morning, we can engage with it and say, instead of giving into it, we can say, God, I need your help to be strong in this moment. During Lent, we prepare for Easter. And we prepare because it helps us deal with temptation. Jesus was tempted to turn those stones to bread. He really was tempted because he was so hungry. It was real. And how could he resist? Why? Why did he resist? Because before we get to the bread, as 4 verse 1 starts out, he was prepared. Jesus set the example for us in this regard and resisted because of those opening lines. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, and then it goes on, returned. What was he? He was full of the Holy Spirit. How did he get full of the Holy Spirit? He was engaged with his Father in heaven. He was ever aware of God through everything he did. He was praying and seeking God. This Lenten season, as we begin this journey toward Easter, let us be fully prepared for the temptations that surround us. The temptations today or tomorrow are no different than the temptations yesterday. They're still with us. And just because we prepare doesn't mean they're going to go away. That's why Luke 4:13 ends the way it does. The devil or the temptation that lurks within us doesn't go away. It just waits for a more opportune time. That's how the verse ends. So even though we may resist the temptation, we can't, I'm going to rip my coat, pat ourselves on the back and say, well done, good and faithful servant. That's God to say that. That's up to God. That's not us to say it about ourselves. What we do is we continue to seek God, continue to strive for God. Let us be prepared. Every one of us faces different temptations. And your temptations, although we may share one about the smartphone or technology or gizmos or consumerism or materialism, we may share that. There are those that are completely unique just for you and just for me. Every one of us faces different temptations. Maybe a juicy bit of gossip that's just too good not to share with another person. I'm not even going to mention the temptation to overeat. I was with friends the other night, and the food was there, and I was full, but it was so good to keep eating. Maybe you face darker temptations, or you know somebody who does, like drug or alcohol addiction, infidelity, betrayal of friends and loved ones, greed, lust, licentiousness, envy, pride. The list goes on and on. That there's no limit to the temptations that can come into our lives because there's no limit to the creativity that God gave us. With Jesus, we don't get a magic cure. We see a model to imitate. We can follow Jesus' example and be full of the Holy Spirit if we seek God with our whole hearts. When the temptation comes to just reduce our engagement with God just a little bit, just today, we can resist it and be strong. And resisting it makes us stronger. And together as a family, as a community on this Lenten journey, we can pray for one another. And each one of us, with God's help and full of the Holy Spirit, we can resist